Okay, great. So we're on page 12 of Simondon's Individuation and Notions of Form and Information. I think this is our third meeting since we started the introduction. So we're starting at, I believe, the first full paragraph on that page, this study. So I can start reading. This study is founded on the following conception of being. Being does not possess a unity of identity, which is that of a stable state wherein no transformation is possible. Being possesses a transductive unity, i.e., it can phase shift with respect to itself. It can overflow itself on both sides from its center. What is taken as a relation or duality of principles is in fact this overflowing expanse of a being, insofar as a being is more than unity and more than identity. Becoming is a dimension of being, not what comes to it according to a succession that would be undergone by an initially given and substantial being. Individuation must be grasped as the being's becoming and not as a model of the being, which would exhaust its signification. The individuated being is neither the whole being nor the first being. Instead of grasping individuation on the basis of the individuated being must be grasped on the basis of individuation, and individuation on the basis of pre-individual being, which is distributed according to several orders of magnitude. So he's arguing here for a sort of reversal of the order of explanation within philosophy. So instead of starting with the individuated entities and then trying to sort of work backwards from there to grasp the principle of individuation on that basis, it goes the other way around. You understand what an individuated being is by understanding the process of individuation that brings it about, and we understand individuation in turn on the basis of the pre-individual from which it arises. So the whole process of understanding starts from the pre-individual, goes through the process of individuation, and then results in the individuated entity that we want to have a grasp or knowledge of. And then the other key point in this paragraph is the notion of this transductive unity, or this being that is more than unity and more than identity. So this is the pre-individual being, which is not characterized by identity or unity in the standard sense. And so the law of excluded middle doesn't apply to pre-individual being. But it does have this unity in this other sense, this transductive unity, meaning that it's a unity that is a result of a process. So it's a process of individuation that creates this unity, rather than the unity being sort of an initial state that pre-exists the process.
One question: what exactly is Simondon meaning in right after transductive unity with phase shift? In what meaning is he using it?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point to bring up. So we saw a little bit last time this his use of the term phase shifting, or his discussion of phases. So this is his characterization of the transductive process, is starting from this initial state, this initial pre-individual state, and then a separation into distinct phases that occurs within the pre-individual. So this would be the separation into different orders of magnitude, for example. In the case of, like what we saw with the example in the footnote last week of the plant that integrates the cosmic order of magnitude and the submolecular order of magnitude, and so that's a result of an individuation process that comes after that separation of those orders of magnitude in the first place. And so that's dephasing or phase shift is that initial separation of those orders of magnitude.
It's also noteworthy that this talk of phase shift stays in the association space of individuation if he's taking this from and metastable systems, right? I think on in the foreword actually it's mentioned that this phase shift concept is also taken from thermodynamics, and when we talk about metastable systems in thermodynamics, and he refers to super saturated or supercooled fluids. We are talking about systems that shouldn't be in the phase that they are in. Like a supercooled fluid is a fluid that is below its point of freezing in temperature. Like it's cooler than it should be, but it hasn't frozen because there wasn't a seed for crystallization yet.
Right. Yeah. So there's the thermodynamic notion of a phase of matter. So liquid, solid, gas. I suppose plasma. I'm not sure that I think there's other sort of exotic phases in more specialized areas of physics. But so the crystallization process that he takes as the paradigm of transduction is a phase shift from a liquid state to a solid state. But I think that's an instance of what he's referring to here with this phase shift, and it doesn't exhaust what he's referring to in the sense that this phase shift is prior to actually constituted matter. So the process of crystallization is an instance of a phase shift, but it's not the only form that phase shift can take, and we have to think of an initial phase shift, which is prior to the actual constitution of matter. That would be this pre-individuated being that separates out into different orders of magnitude. Okay, I think we can go on to the next paragraph. If I can get a volunteer to read.
The intention of this study is therefore to examine the forms, modes, and degrees of individuation in order to put the individual back into being according to the three levels of the physical, the vital, and the psychosocial. Instead of supposing substances so as to account for individuation, we have chosen to take the different regimes of individuation as the basis of various domains such as matter, life, mind, and society. The separation, layering, and relations of these domains appear as aspects of individuation according to its different modalities. The more fundamental notions of first information, metastability, internal resonance, energetic potential, and orders of magnitude are substituted for the notions of substance, form, and matter.
So here, I think the only maybe difficult concept or term that has not really been explained explicitly so far is first information, and this is what we've seen a little bit in this earlier in the introduction, and then as well in the form information potentials reading from a few weeks ago, where Simondon wants to have a theory of qualitative information, or of the generation of information before transmission. So the quantitative theory of information has to do with transmission of information that already exists. and you can only ever lose information in the process of transmission. But what Simondon wants to account for is the generation of that information in the first place before transmission, and so that's why he describes it as first information. So it's the information before transmission, or what accounts for the possibility of transmitting information in the first place. And then the rest of that paragraph is sort of almost a table of contents of the rest of the book, just pointing to the different layers of individuation, or the different regions that he's going to account for in the rest of the book. So we have the physical individuation, vital individuation, psychic, and then collective individuation, as different domains of individuation, or different layers of individuation. We can go on to the next paragraph if someone else would like to read. This one's a bit longer.
Yet, in order for this modification of notions to be possible, it is necessary to introduce both a new method and a new notion. The method consists in not trying to compose the essence of a reality via a conceptual relation between two pre-existing extreme terms, and it also consists in considering every veritable relation as having the status of being. Relation is a modality of being. It is simultaneous with respect to the terms whose existence it guarantees. A relation must be grasped as a relation in being, a relation of being, a manner of being, and not a simple rapport between two terms that could be adequately known via concepts because they would have an effectively prior separate existence. It is because terms are conceived as substances that relation is a rapport of terms, and that being is separated into terms, since being is initially, before any examination of individuation, conceived as substance. Conversely, if substance is no longer the model of being, it is possible to conceive relation as the being's non-identity vis-a-vis itself, the inclusion in the being of a reality which is not merely identical with it, such that being qua being before any individuation can be comprehended as more than unity and more than identity. This kind of method supposes an ontological type of postulate at the level of being grasped before any individuation. The principle of the excluded middle and the principle of identity are no longer applicable. These principles only apply to the already individuated being, and they define an impoverished being that is separated into milieu and individual. Consequently, they do not apply to the being's whole, to the ensemble formed later on by the milieu and the individual, but merely to what of pre-individual being has become individual. In this sense, classical logic cannot be used to think individuation, for it forces us to think the operation of individuation with concepts and rapport among concepts that merely apply to the results of the operation of individuation considered partially.
Right, so here he's getting into some notions of method, some ideas about the method to be followed in this book. And he also, so he's bringing back some themes that we've already seen about relations. And so here we have to distinguish between relation and rapport, which is at the level of translation, it's maybe not ideal. I'm not sure if there really exists a better term in English, but rapport we tend to use that for some sort of more intense or deep relationship with another person. Having a good rapport with someone, meaning having a connection with them. Whereas here, rapport is used for external relations, so relations that don't make up the being of the related terms, or where the terms pre-exists that relation, or pre-exists that rapport between them. So yeah, that's just to keep in mind that relation is used in the sense of internal relation, and then rapport is used in the sense of external relation. And then, so he also again mentions the this relativization of classical logic, in the sense that classical logic with the principle of excluded middle only applies to already individuated beings or entities, rather than to the pre-individual being that underlies them. So we can't think pre-individual being using concepts in the precise sense that Simondon uses the term. So concepts would be characterized by classical logic and the law of excluded middle, whereas transductive thinking is not conceptual, and it's the means by which we grasp pre-individual being. I guess I should just mention, everyone's being a little bit quiet today, but feel free to ask questions or make comments on the mic or in the chat if anything comes up. But if there are no other comments on that section, then we can go on to the next paragraph, which is like a page long. So any volunteers?
The usage of this method, which considers the principle of identity and the principle of the excluded middle as too narrow, unlocks a notion that has a multitude of aspects and domains of application, that of transduction. By transduction, we mean a physical, biological, mental, or social operation through which an activity propagates incrementally within a domain by basing this propagation on a structuration of the domain operated from one region to another. Each structural region serves as a principle and model, so as an initiator for constituting the following region, such that a modification thereby extends progressively through this structuring operation. The simplest image of the transductive operation is provided by the crystal, which, starting from a tiny germ, increases and extends following all the directions in its supersaturated mother liquor. Each previously constituted molecular layer serves as the structuring basis for the layer in the process of forming. The result is an amplifying reticular structure. The transductive operation is an individuation in progress. Within the physical domain, it can be effectuated in the simplest way via progressive iteration. But within more complex domains, like the domains of vital metastability or of the psychical problematic, it can advance with a constantly variable pace and extend into a domain of heterogeneity. There is transduction when there is an activity that starts from a being's structural and functional center and extends in various directions based on its center, as if multiple dimensions of the being appeared around this center. Transduction is the correlative appearance of dimensions and structures within a being in a state of pre-individual tension, i.e. in a being which is more than unity and more than identity, and which has not yet phase shifted with respect to itself in multiple dimensions. The extreme terms attained by the transductive operation do not exist before this operation. Its dynamism stems from the initial tension of the system of the heterogeneous being that phase shifts and develops dimensions according to which it will be structured. It does not come from a tension between terms that will be attained and deposited at the extreme limits of transduction. Transduction can be a vital operation. In particular, it expresses the orientation of organic individuation. It can be a psychical operation and an effective logical procedure, although it is not at all limited to logical thought. In the domain of knowledge, it defines the veritable measure of invention, which is neither inductive nor deductive but transductive, i.e. corresponds to a discovery of the dimensions according to which a problematic can be defined. It is an analogical operation, at least based on what is valid about this kind of operation. This notion can be used to think the different domains of individuation. It applies to all cases where an individuation is realized, manifesting the genesis of a web of rapports founded on the being. The possibility of using an analogical transduction to think a domain of reality indicates that this domain is effectively the groundwork of a transductive structuration. Transduction corresponds to this existence of rapports that takes hold when pre-individual being individuates. It expresses individuation and allows for individuation to be thought. It is therefore a notion that is both metaphysical and logical. It applies to ontogenesis and is ontogenesis itself. Objectively, it makes it possible to understand the systematic conditions of individuation, internal resonance, and the psychical problematic. Logically, it can be used as the basis of a new type of analogical paradigmatism in order to pass from physical individuation to organic individuation, from organic individuation to psychical individuation, and from psychical individuation to the subjective and objective trans-individual, all of which defines the plan of this research.
So in the last paragraph, he said that there was a method and a notion, which a new method and notion that have to be introduced. And so he talked about the method in the last paragraph, and here he's talking about the notion, which is transduction. But it's itself, this notion is itself a methodological notion, as he explains in this paragraph. So he's it's a notion of the theory, but it's also the principle according to which the theory is organized as well at the same time. So he gives a definition of sorts of transduction. And he says, we understand by transduction a physical, biological, mental, or social relationship by means of which an activity propagates incrementally within a domain. And so that's the sort of general definition of what transduction would mean. But I think it's more productive to understand transduction through the example that he gives, and this is itself a transductive operation, because transduction is a paradigmatic thought. It's a thought that a way of thinking in which an initial germ structures an initially unstructured domain. And so I think we can understand this crystal example as itself a structural germ that around which the rest of our thought will become structured. So yeah, the crystal example is one that we've talked about before, and that we'll see in more detail in the initial chapter of the book. But the general idea is you have a supersaturated solution in which a germ, this germ crystal forms, and then around that crystal, around the germ, the solution crystallizes in layers. So progressively around the edge or the limit of that already formed crystal, it will continue to crystallize until the whole solution is crystallized. And so this is the paradigm that he introduces for this notion of transduction. So then there's also this. So that's the basic idea of transduction, is this progressive structuring operation in an initially unstructured domain. But then he also characterizes this transduction as the appearance, the correlative appearance of dimensions and structures in a being in a pre-individual state of tension. And so this notion of dimensions points back towards the example that I mentioned last time of binocular vision. And so the way that in binocular vision we resolve the problem of the disparation of the retinal images on two eyes. We resolve that problem not by abstracting from the two retinal images to preserve only what is common, but rather by preserving the disparation itself, and by introducing a new dimension in depth perception. And so that he takes that as a paradigm of how transductive operations resolve problems by introducing a new dimension to a situation, to a system. So that's where that notion of dimension comes in. And then there's the important point that he makes as well, is that this notion of transduction is both a metaphysical and a logical notion at the same time. So it characterizes a process that is occurring in beings. So there is this process of individuation is a process that is occurring in beings outside of us, and then it's also a process that our knowledge undergoes. And we're going to see, I think, in the next couple paragraphs, his claim that our knowledge of processes of individuation is itself an individuation in our knowledge. So the only way to know a process of individuation is through this transductive process within knowledge, so undergoing a process of individuation ourselves. So there's this analogical relationship between the transductive process in beings and then the transductive process in our knowledge, and so they have themselves between these two transductive processes, there's this relation of analogy.
Yeah, I want to try to contrast that with, so he contrasts it with inductive and deductive. Yeah, so my instinct is to think of transduction as a kind of as a process of being, right? So there is this supersaturated solution, you drop the germ, and then the whole thing starts to transform, right? So I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do we think of this as actually a kind of logical or like a procedure of thinking? And so a quick contrast. So an inductive logic would be when we begin with a thing and we abstract from it, right? Like, let's say we get a few different types of rabbits, and then we say, oh, all rabbits have, this kind of ear, or they're all furry, and so on. It's like a bottom up, and then the deductive goes down from like an a priori principle or postulate or whatever, and then we derive conclusions from that. And I guess I'm trying to understand how to think of transduction in these terms. Maybe this is coming in the next paragraphs, I guess. Maybe this is just jumping the gun. But yeah, because the instinct my instinct at least, is to see it as a process of being.
Right. So that's a helpful summary of inductive and deductive knowledge. So induction starts from particulars and then abstracts from what is particular to each of them, and derives a universal or a relative universal. So this rabbit is furry, this second rabbit is furry, third rabbit is furry, etc. Therefore, rabbits are furry in general. Whereas the deductive knowledge or a deductive mode of thinking starts from an initial universal and then deduces a particular from that. So if you have a statement that all rabbits are furry, and then this is a rabbit, then you can conclude that this entity is going to be furry. I mean, these are sort of toy examples. They're not very interesting accounts of or instances of inductive and deductive knowledge. But I think that point that you made, and what Angus pointed out in the chat here, the point about the relationship between a posteriori and a priori is relevant here, because in a footnote that we saw last week, which I think is very important, which unfortunately is put as an end node in the English translation, so it's not right on the same page. But the footnote where Simondon talks about the notion of a priori and a posteriori as yes, exactly, Laith Mason. So he introduces this notion of a presenti as an alternative to a priori and a posteriori. So the traditional account of knowledge as an encounter or joining of a priori and a posteriori, or the form and the content, or concepts and sensations, or something along those lines. That account of knowledge remains in the hylomorphic schema that Simondon is criticizing, because it doesn't account for that dark zone, that region of interaction between the concept and the sensations, or form and content, however you want to specify that distinction. So we don't have, on this theory, we don't have an account of how sensations are supposed to be subsumed under concepts, or what exactly the form is supposed to do to the content. Whereas what Simondon is going to argue for here is precisely this, starting from this dark zone, or this intermediary position, and this would be a kind of knowledge that in which the knowledge is contemporary with what is known, rather than being an a priori form or an a posteriori content. So knowledge that is generated at the same time as the interaction with the thing known. So yeah, so transductive knowledge then would be a knowledge that is itself a process of individuation that's contemporary with the process of individuation in the reality that you're trying to know, rather than a concept that you sort of bring a priori to the thing known, or something that would be abstracted from the particular things known in inductive knowledge. So that's the sort of general orientation of transductive thinking or transductive knowledge.
Is it by that characterization then thinking that is not trying to be static, in a sense that you try to understand, for example, a tree as just exemplification of the static concept in a specific degenerated form, so to speak, when we think about Plato's understanding of ideas as the absolute form, so to speak, that all the other things are derived from. But the transductive thinking is something that is developing in a very dynamic way and is trying to in some form the operation that is also inherent to the object that is looking at, even so some kind of responsivity, or maybe a form of resonance or recreation within the thought.
Yeah, I think that's right, because in the On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, his other main book that we read in a previous iteration of this reading group, we saw his criticism of classificatory approaches to knowledge. So this would be a form of knowledge that precisely understands entities in terms of something like a static essence. So you subsume the particulars under the species and the species under the genus, and so on. And the species and the genus are these sort of fixed concepts, and you lose you lose information the more you ascend from the particular to the species and to the genus and so on. And he criticizes this form of knowing, in particular with reference to technical objects. But here we see a more general rejection of that type of knowledge, and his account, or his theory of essences, or of the being of entities, is going to be a genetic account, which is something that he sets out in his in the third part of that book of on the mode of existence of technical objects. He gives a genetic account of human being in the world, and the different dimensions of a philosophical anthropology. And so, in general, transductive thinking is a genetic thinking, in the sense that it understands the being of the entities that is known, that are known, understands that being in terms of a becoming, in dynamic terms rather than in static terms.
So just to expand on that a little bit, I'm thinking about the example of the and how. So I'm thinking about the example of the crystal and how thinking might relate to that. So so the way I take it, the crystal works. The examples that I saw online. So there is a beaker, let's say, and it's filled with this supersaturated solution, which apparently is a solution that holds more of a kind of, I think it's some kind of salt, than water can ordinarily hold. And it's sort of been, I think it's through heating that they get it sort of oversaturated. And so it's in a way, it has this state of tension, and it's waiting, right, for something to happen, but it's in a relatively stable state. And I guess that's the metastability. And then somebody drops in a tiny little speck of crystal, and then the whole thing crystallizes right in the beaker, and it's pretty impressive to watch. Now, what I'm thinking is, okay, so this is what we're seeing there is a process of being, but it must be that the same thing is happening in the observer, like in the one who knows this process. Like, as we're watching this process unfold, we must have a kind of metastable state that is, I guess that's what the mind is, before it comes to know. And then having this observation is a little bit like dropping a germ inside the mind. And then this kind of process unfolds, and that's the process of knowing. That seems like a way to bring the two together, maybe. And it would be different from, induction would be like, okay, here's an observation of a crystal that just formed, and let's get a few more, and then we can derive some laws. But now this is somehow sort of, induction seems to be very static, and this is somehow happening kind of dynamically, the transduction, and sort of in real time, I guess, as the as the crystal is forming. So that's how I can put them together. I don't know if this makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. I really like it. And it reminds me of the critique that Peirce gives in relation to deduction and induction as well, because for him it lacks the concept, or the ability to discover something totally new. And that's for him the only proper syllogistic way to introduce something new in our understanding of logic and of epistemology is abduction. So it's this third way of deducing in his understanding from a very plausible ad hoc hypothesis, because we are confronted with a new and an yet unknown event. And for him, deduction and induction are just two forms to bring or to transform already known things, but in a new manner. But there's not aspect of novelty to them in a very broad way speaking.
Yeah, I think the connection between Simondon and Peirce and the notion of transduction and abduction is something that would be interesting to investigate further. I'm sure that it exists in the secondary literature, but I'm not sure. I haven't seen it myself. But I think that your account that you gave there of transduction in the observation process, I think that's broadly correct. We'll see more about how psychic individuation works when we get to that part of the book. Yeah, I think in general that's correct, that we have to understand the knowledge of the observer as being in a metastable state, and then undergoing individuation through this contact with an external reality.
I could read the next paragraph. We could certainly assert that transduction would not be presented as a logical procedure having a proof value. Furthermore, we don't mean to say that transduction is a logical procedure in the current sense of the term. It is a mental procedure, and even much more than a procedure. It is the mind's way of discovering. This way of discovering consists in following the being in its genesis, in accomplishing the genesis of thought at the same time as the genesis of the object is accomplished. In this research, it is called upon to play a role that dialectics could not play. Though the study of the operation of individuation does not seem to correspond to the appearance of the negative as a second stage, but to an immanence of the negative within the initial condition through the ambivalent form of tension and incompatibility. This is what is most positive in the state of pre-individual being, namely the existence of potentials, which is also the cause of the incompatibility and non-stability of this state. The negative appears initially as an ontogenetic incompatibility, but it is in actuality merely the other side of a wealth of potentials. Therefore, it is not a substantial negative. It is never a stage or phase. And individuation is not a synthesis or return to unity, but the phase shift of the being based on its pre-individual center of potentialized incompatibility. From this ontogenetic perspective, time itself is considered as an expression of the dimensionality of the being that is individuating.
Yeah, so there's a lot in this paragraph. So first, we have this sort of qualification of transductive thought as not having the value or the status of a proof. So it characterizes, transductive thinking is what characterizes the process of discovery, as opposed to what in philosophy of science there's this distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification. And so transductive thinking would have to do with the context of discovery rather than the context of justification. It doesn't offer a proof for a proposition, but that doesn't mean that it's not a logical process in the sense of in a sort of extended sense in which we would use logical to mean the relation of thinking to a truth or something along those lines. So the transductive thinking is in fact a logical thinking in the sense that it brings about knowledge of an entity in this process of discovery. but it's not logical in the sense of proving a proposition. And then we also have his introduction of this concept of genesis, which I just mentioned a little while ago. He explains that the procedure, this transductive procedure, is consists in following a being in its genesis, and that means, or synonymously, it's carrying out a genesis within thought at the same time as the genesis of the object. So the process of knowing, or the capacity to know an ontogenetic process is itself genetic, is itself a process of becoming and of individuation. And then so there's always that relationship of analogy between the process in the entity and then the process within our knowledge. And then the last sort of major point here is this distinction between transduction and dialectics. So the sort of initial characterization of that distinction is that there's no moment of negation in the way that there is in the dialectical process. So we don't have a moment of negation. But then he also sort of turns that around to say that the negation is present in the initial stage, rather than forming a second moment of the process. So in that initial stage, in the pre-individual being, we have this incompatibility and tension of potentials. And so we can characterize this as a form of negation, but he wants to qualify that again by saying that this is not a substantial negation. So it's not that the moment of the negative would itself be a substantial moment or something with its own independence. Rather, this insofar as we want to describe the initial pre-individual state as having negation, it's a sort of internal negation built into it. And then because there's this this process of individuation, or this transductive process, begins with the already existing incompatibility and so on. The process can't be characterized as
Oh, this looks like a disconnect. Okay, I guess we are waiting now.
So the way that I'm thinking of this difference from dialectics, I guess drawing on Zizek too, some of his formulations. So dialectics would say, yes, there's being and everything that can be affirmed, but then there is nothing. There is this substantive negation. And that substantive negation kind of then initiates this process of a logical, I guess it's a logical becoming. I think that's what Hegel wants it to be anyway. And it takes a lot of flack that it's not actually real becoming. And I guess, so I guess what Simondon is saying is, actually there's nothing beyond, there is no nothingness outside of ontology. The negation is kind of inscribed in the ontological field of potentials. And really, the negation is really the incompatibility of potentials. So like like in the supersaturated solution, actually there being more dissolved salt than the amount of water can handle. And so it's sitting in this state of kind of it's got this inherent instability that's only waiting to be triggered. And I guess that's the negative for Simondon, and it's not substantive. It's kind of just inscribed in the field of potentials themselves.
Right, I missed a bit of that, but what I heard, I agree with, that it's precisely the fact that this negation is not an independent moment of the process, of the dialectical process. Instead, we have this initial incompatibility, or this initial tension, that allows for the transductive process, or that acts as the motor of the transductive process, and for that, because of that distinction, this transduction is not a dialectical process.
I'm curious if Simondon ever, actually a couple of things. I'm curious if he relates himself to the Stoics in any way, because I've seen some secondary sources that do that, kind of connect them with some aspects of Stoic thinking. And I'm also wondering if he ever talks about what potential is, like if he ever goes deeper into that, or is it just a kind of primitive, sort of primitive notion?
Yeah, there is some discussion of the Stoics in one of the complementary texts to this book, which is called History of the Notion of the Individual, which is basically a history of philosophy as a whole, in light of the notion of the individual. So what different schools of philosophy have said about the individual and the concept of the individual. Yeah, there's some discussion of the Stoics in there. I can't remember a lot of the details of what he takes from them, but I think it has more to do with the Stoic ethics rather than Stoic physics. And then on the notion of potential, there's another one of the complementary texts in this book, which is form, information, and potentials, which we read the discussion portion of, but we didn't read the article itself, which we'll get to eventually, as we after we finish the book itself. But when we get to the complementary texts. So the notion of potential is, it's not quite a primitive notion, in the sense that he's borrowing it from physics. So he's taking the physical notion of potential as a paradigm, and then using it to understand other domains of thinking, rather than strictly as a physical notion. Okay, I think we can go on to the next bit, which I can read, assuming my computer doesn't crash. Okay. Transduction is therefore not merely the reasoning of the mind, it is also intuition, because it is that through which a structure appears in a domain of a problematic as providing the resolution to the problem posed. But contrary to deduction, transduction does not go elsewhere to seek a principle to resolve the problem of a domain. It extracts the resolving structure from the very tensions of this domain, just as the supersaturated solution crystallizes due to its own potentials and according to the chemical species that it holds, not with the contribution of some foreign form. It is also not comparable to induction, for induction truly conserves the characteristics of the terms of reality included in the studied domain, drawing the structures of the analysis from these terms themselves, but it only conserves what is posited in these terms, i.e. what is common to all terms, thereby eliminating what is singular from them. On the contrary, transduction is a discovery of dimensions whose system makes the dimensions of each of the terms communicate, such that the complete reality of each of the terms of the domain is into newly discovered structures without loss or reduction. Resolving transduction operates the inversion of the negative into the positive, that through which the terms are not identical to one another, that through which they are disparate, in the sense that this term assumes three-dimensional vision. It integrated into the system of resolution and becomes a condition of signification. There is no impoverishment of information contained in the terms. Transduction is characterized by the fact that the result of this operation is a concrete fabric including all the initial terms. The resulting system is made of that which has become made and includes the whole concrete. A transductive order conserves the concrete and is characterized by the conservation of information, whereas induction requires a loss of information. Just like dialectics, transduction conserves and integrates the opposed aspects. Unlike dialectics, transduction does not suppose the existence of a preliminary time as the framework in which the genesis unfurls, since time itself is a solution, a dimension of the discovered systematic. Time emerges from the pre-individual, just like the other dimensions, according to which individuation effectuates itself. So here we have a characterization of transductive thinking or transductive knowledge as intuition, which we've, I think, mentioned a couple times sort of in passing, but this is definitely a Bergsonian resonance here. In Bergson, there's this notion of intuition as the knowledge of duration, of the inner experience of time, and Simondon has a slightly different notion of intuition in the sense that for him there's no whereas for Bergson there's this strict distinction between the inner experience of time or this inextended duration, and then on the other hand the perception of extended substance in space. For Simondon, we can have intuitive knowledge of entities in space. We can have the intuition applies to anything that can undergo this process of transduction. So it's not limited to an inner experience of time. We can also have intuition or an intuitive knowledge of entities outside of ourselves, insofar as they are undergoing a transductive process or this process of genesis. And then he specifies here in this paragraph, he distinguishes transductive knowledge from inductive and deductive knowledge in basically the same way as we were talking about earlier. It's distinguished from inductive knowledge in the sense that it doesn't lose information, whereas knowledge only preserves what's common in terms, and then loses everything particular. Transductive knowledge preserves the particular, and then it's distinguished from deductive knowledge because it doesn't draw a principle from outside of the problem. So within deductive knowledge, you always have to start from a universal principle and then deduce something from it, deduce a particular from that universal. So in transductive knowledge, on the other hand, we start from the problem itself, and we don't have to start from a universal outside of the problem. And then he also introduces that example of binocular vision that I mentioned, and the discovery of a dimension as a paradigm of the resolution of a problem, or the resolution of an incompatibility in a system. And then there's this difficult notion of time as arising out of this process of individuation. So for Simondon, time is itself a dimension that has a genesis within the process of individuation. So rather than time being a sort of frame in which the process of transduction occurs, as he suggests is the case for dialectics. He here is arguing or suggesting, I suppose, that we should understand time as itself being a dimension that is a result of a genesis.
So I'm curious about a couple of things. I don't want to hog the space, but it seems like
yeah, no, go ahead.
There are no takers. Yeah. Well, in an earlier paragraph, he said something interesting. Yeah, so there was something interesting in an earlier paragraph where the germ, I think he called it a model. So in the crystallization process, I guess the bit of crystal that's put in acts as a kind of model in the genesis, and then so there's a hint, I guess, of a kind of form matter polar, or there is some this distinction of roles, I guess, between the germ that enters and then the metastable field that is transformed, sort of on the model of the germ. But I suppose it's all of it is going to be relative. You know, this relationship is going to be relative to the particular kind of milieu that we're dealing with. I guess what I'm thinking is that, like, there is a sense of asymmetry, and I guess that asymmetry really is what's driving the process.
Yeah, there's a couple points here. So that passage where he used the term model is actually I noticed that as someone was reading it, and I was looking at I was looking at the French, and the word model is not in the French actually. So it was introduced by the translator. I was just trying to find the passage again, but I can't find it quickly. Oh yes, here it is. So he says each region of structure, each constituted region of structure serves to the following region as a principle of constitution. So rather, he doesn't use the word model there. He just says principle of constitution. But I think that does raise an interesting point or difficulty for Simondon's account that we talked about a little bit last time, I think, or maybe it's the previous meeting. But the status of these germs, these initial germs, is a little bit obscure, or he seems to hesitate as to what status he wants to assign to them. Because in the crystallization example, the germs come in from outside, so there's an already constituted crystal, just a tiny piece of crystal, but it's something already constituted, already individuated, that is introduced into the solution, and then on the basis of that germ or surrounding that germ, the rest of the solution crystallizes. But that if we want to take that account where the germ is something already constituted and individuated that is introduced from outside the system, doesn't fit with the rest of what he wants this notion of transduction to do. And then the sort of alternate account of these germs is one that he in the form information potentials discussion or in the paper, and then in the discussion that we read a couple weeks ago, he sort of brings up this idea, but then hesitates to use it. But he suggests the idea that the germs would arise through chance. So there would be this moment of chance, and I think real life crystallization processes do have this element of chance in them, because the supersaturated solution can crystallize without having an external germ introduced, like we think of the way that water will freeze if the temperature is low enough, and there doesn't need to be an external crystal, an external already constituted crystal introduced into the solution. But he introduces this idea that there's this chance element for the germs, but then he sort of says it's difficult to accept that there would be a role of chance in this operation, something along those lines. I don't remember the exact wording. So I think he's aware of this problem of where these germs come from and whether they're sort of external or internal, but he doesn't have a good solution to that problem, and he doesn't want to have recourse to a role of chance in the transductive process.
I guess the difficulty philosophically would be how do we get the process started in the first place? If everything is a metastable field, let's say, then there must be that first germ, right? That gets the metastable solution sort of developing or transducing. And yeah, so I can see how chance could do it. Could he spell this out just in terms of the differences of potentials? Just in terms of, let's say there is a difference in between the potential within one region of the entire field and then some nearby region. Or is the danger that, the problem is, why hasn't everything just remained as in a metastable state? Why isn't everything just a kind of metastable solution forever kind of dwelling in that metastability?
Yeah, I think that's a good characterization of the problem. So I think like you sort of sketched out there, the idea that there would be some sort of relationship between the potentials in the initial pre-individual state that would bring about the process of transduction and individuation. I think that doesn't work because then we're still always remaining at the level of potentials rather than of actuality, and then it seems as if we need something actual in order to get the process of individuation that will result in a new actuality. Like in order to get that process going, we need something actual like that germ, that initial impetus to the whole process. But if we do accept that there is something actual introduced from outside to start the whole process, then we've sort of just pushed the problem back another step, because then we need to have an account of where that germ comes from. Yeah, I think this is a serious difficulty for Simondon, and I think possibly the reason why he doesn't want to use this notion of chance is because it would play a similar role in his account as the Kleinemann in the atomistic theory. As we talked about a little bit a couple weeks ago, when we saw Simondon's criticism of the atomistic theory, in this account you start with atoms falling in the void, but if the atoms just are all falling, they'd all be falling in parallel tracks to each other. There would be no contact between the atoms. And so in order to account for the composite bodies made up of many atoms, we have to introduce this notion of the Kleinemann, or the swerve, which makes some of the atoms deviate from the the perpendicular path, and then allows atoms to come into contact with each other. And this notion of the Klein has always been criticized as being sort of arbitrarily thrown in just to account for the existence of composite bodies. And I think Simondon doesn't want to introduce a notion of chance for a similar reason, because it would seem to be sort of an arbitrary introduction of this notion just to account for that actuality that starts the whole process of individuation. So yeah, I think there's a real problem on this point in Simondon's theory.
It's interesting how he's between two extremes in a way, because as you're talking about the atomists, I'm thinking of Aristotle and his solution. So that will be the hylomorphic account, right? And his solution is to introduce this supreme actuality, right? The prime mover. And the prime mover is a final cause for every development, every actualizing of potential. And that's obviously not, so the prime mover, I guess, is a kind of form, right? The supreme form. And very clearly that's not what Simondon wants. But it seems like he would need some kind of, some kind of, like, I guess the germ is an analog of that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you cut out there again, or if you were done. But yeah, I think that's right. I think the germ plays a similar role in Simondon's theory as the prime mover does in Aristotle's theory, insofar as they're both this moment of actuality that accounts for the process of becoming, and which of course doesn't mean, because we have this problematic point, we have doesn't mean that the rest of the theory is to be rejected or something like that. I think there's a lot of value in the rest of what Simondon develops for us, and precisely like Angus said, there is that explaining the interaction between form and matter in a much more concrete way than the hylomorphic theory is capable of doing. But I think it's worth pointing out this problematic point, and keeping it in mind as we continue reading.
However, in order to think the transductive operation, which is the basis of individuation in its various levels, the notion of form is insufficient. The notion of hylomorphic form is part of the same system of thought as that of substance, or that of rapport, as a relation posterior to the existence of terms. These notions have been elaborated based on the results of individuation. They can only grasp an impoverished real without potentials, and consequently one that is incapable of individuating. And you're saying the next one as well.
Yeah, the next one too. Thank you.
The notion of form must be replaced with that of information, which supposes the existence of a system in a state of metastable equilibrium that can individuate. Unlike form, information is never a single term, but the signification that emerges from a disparation. The ancient notion of form, such as the hylomorphic schema upholds, is too independent from any notion of system and metastability. The notion of form provided by Gestalt theory, on the contrary, conveys the notion of system and is defined in the state toward which the system tends when it finds its equilibrium. It is a resolution of tension. Sadly, an overly superficial physical paradigmatism has led Gestalt theory to consider that the only state of equilibrium of a system that can resolve tensions is the state of stable equilibrium. Gestalt theory has ignored metastability. We would like to take up Gestalt theory again, and with the introduction of a quantum condition, show that the problems posed by Gestalt theory cannot be directly resolved via the notion of stable equilibrium, but only via the notion of metastable equilibrium. Good form is therefore no longer simple form, pregnant geometrical form, but significative form, significative form, i.e., that which establishes a transductive order within a system of reality bearing potentials. This good form is what maintains the energetic level of the system, conserves its potentials by making them compatible. It is the structure of compatibility and viability. It is the invented dimensionality according to which there is compatibility without degradation. The notion of form then deserves to be replaced by that of information. During this replacement, the notion of information must never be reduced to signals or supports or vehicles of information, as the technological theory of information tends to do when it is siphoned by abstraction from the technology of transmissions. The pure notion of form must therefore be saved twice from an overly superficial technological paradigmatism. First, relative to ancient culture due to the reductive usage of the notion of the hylomorphic schema. Second, relative to the state of the notion of information in modern culture, to save information as signification from the technological theory of information, conceived by way of the experience of transmissions through a channel. For we actually uncover the same goal at work in the successive theories of hylomorphism, good form, and then information. The goal that seeks to discover the inherence of significations to being. And it is precisely this inherence that we would like to discover in the operation of individuation.
Right. Yeah. So thanks for that. So here we have, again, coming back to this criticism of the notion of form that we saw in the form, information, and potentials paper. And in particular, the criticism of Gestalt psychology as a theory of form. And so in Gestalt psychology, there's this tendency to understand form, the good form, as being the one that resolves tension in the sense of a stable equilibrium. So it's the lowest energy state of the system. And then, so Simondon argues that we have to instead understand, we have to instead use this notion of information rather than of form, or insofar as we want to think about form, it has to be a form relative to information. And this is again the primary information or first information, which underlies the information insofar as it can be transmitted. So it's here information means the quality of being a good form rather than the quantitative measure of information that can be transmitted through a channel. And so we saw this example in the form, information, potentials discussion. He says that if you take if you dump a bucket of sand on a table, and then you want to transmit accurately the position of each grain of sand on the table, it would take a huge amount of information to transmit. But and it's precisely because it's not structured that it would require so much information to transmit that position. Whereas if you draw a rectangle or something like that, and you wanted to transmit that rectangle to another person, you could transmit with a much lower quantity of information just by specifying the dimensions of the rectangle. But in the more fundamental sense, the rectangle is more structured. It has more of this tension of information or primary information than just the bucket of sand dumped on the table. And so this is the dimension of information that he is interested in here. And so what makes that rectangle a good form is precisely that so it's not that it's the lowest state of energy of the system, but precisely because it has the capacity to structure someone else's knowledge. So someone who receives that rectangle can undergo a process of individuation in their own knowledge that would be structured by the rectangle they receive. And so it's the capacity to bring about that transformation that characterizes a good form. And so he says we need to replace this notion of form with one of information, and then we have to sort of save this notion of form from these two possible dangers that it can undergo. So on the one hand, it can be reduced to ancient culture, or it can be used in this reductive way in connection with ancient culture. So talking about ancient Greece here, and then it becomes the notion in the hylomorphic schema of a form that it's imposed on a matter in some obscure way, and then we don't have this understanding of the interaction between form and matter. And then the second danger is that form will be reduced to this notion of information as what is transmitted through a channel, and what we have to hold on to opposed to these two dangers is the understanding of signification as inherent in being, as he puts it. And this is what the notion of individuation and transduction is supposed to explain for us.
Right, because when we look at information in this sense of early communications theory after Shannon and Weaver, for example, in this signal model, a triangle is very very simple. So it is more informed in the sense than the pile of sand, because this is so unstructured. And okay, it didn't work in live chat, but I tried to make a very simple triangle. Just the top of it won't fit. Just goes back to the top of the line. I don't know why. But because a triangle can be transmitted so simple, just with 6 different dots, for example, it has a lot of redundant information. You could, for example, have a triangle with a lot of information that you need to transmit it by, for example, use continuous lines that are made of almost infinitely many points. So it could also be something with infinite information. But I guess his point here is that we shouldn't reduce information to this simple transmission in a technological sense, because then the genetic structures and the genesis of different forms, so to speak, or of intensities get lost. then don't know how it's just a simple schema that we reinterpret as something as a triangle, but it's just simple signals that were transmitted. We don't know by just looking at it how a triangle is constructed in a mathematical manner, or what is the whole construction process in geometry of behind a triangle. That's something that we only would understand in a very deeply theoretical framework, and in this framework of transduction, right?
Yeah, I think that example of the triangle, that you can like, for example, you can take a photograph of a triangle and transmit that photograph through some sort of electronic communication means, and then that photograph of the triangle would be transmitted with exactly the same amount of information as the photograph of the pile of sand, and so the photograph itself doesn't pick up on the structure of the triangle. It just captures the image, but without having any sort of grasp of structure. But what the issue that Simondon has with this notion of information is not that it's incorrect or something like that, because it has these specific technological applications, but it's that it doesn't map onto correctly to the way that we understand individuation. The way that we understand information in just sort of the informal use of the term. So we would say that the triangle has more information than just the random pile of sand or just random dots on a piece of paper or something like that. We would understand that as so it has that quality of being a good form in the sense of Gestalt psychology, but it is actually transmissible using much less information than the pile of sand. So he wants to account for that sort of more everyday use of the term of information, and so information in that sense would be not just what is transmitted through the message, but the structuring that precedes the transmission. And so this is for him is a more fundamental notion of information, and so that's why he sometimes uses that term first information or primary information. And so this notion of information underlies the transmission process. So it's only because there is already this process of generation of primary information. It's only because that exists that we can secondarily transmit information across a communication channel. And then Angus had a question in the chat here. Is he drawing a link between, sorry, just a sec. Is he drawing a link between the good form and binocular vision in that it preserves potentials rather than subtracting from the available information? I think, so the binocular vision example is that it's, as you said, it's in binocular vision, we incorporate the disparation of the two retinal images rather than abstracting from what is different between them. We incorporate that disparation and generate the third dimension or depth perception. And the notion of information plays a similar role in the sense that the information has to do with the pre-existing tension within the system. So there's always the tension that pre-exists the process of individuation, and what characterizes something as a good form is its capacity to compatibilize or make compatible these disparate elements of the system that previously did not have a connection to each other, or that were previously incompatible. And so it's the discovery of a dimension in the same way as binocular vision includes this discovery of a dimension in depth perception. Okay, we're almost at time, but we have one paragraph left, so I can read it in just a second when I scroll down. Thus, a study of individuation can tend toward a reform of fundamental philosophical notions, for it is possible to consider individuation as what must be known beforehand about being. Even before wondering how it is legitimate or illegitimate to bear judgments on beings, it can be considered that being is said in two senses. In a first fundamental sense, being is insofar as it is, but in a second sense, always superposed on the first sense in logical theory, being is being insofar as it is individuated. If it were true that logic bears on statements relative to being only after individuation, a theory of being anterior to all logic would have to be established. This theory could serve as the foundation to logic, for nothing proves in advance that being is individuated in a single possible way. If several types of individuation existed, several logics would also have to exist, each corresponding to a definite type of individuation. The classification of ontogeneses would make it possible to pluralize logic with a valid foundation of plurality. As for the axiomatization of the knowledge of pre-individual being, it cannot be contained in a preliminary logic, for no norm or system detached from its content can be defined. By being accomplished, only the individuation of thought can accompany the individuation of beings other than thought. We therefore cannot have an immediate knowledge or a mediated knowledge of individuation, but we can have a knowledge that is an operation parallel to the operation known. We can know individuation in the ordinary sense of the term. We cannot know individuation in the ordinary sense of the term. We can only individuate, be individuated, and individuate within ourselves. This apprehension is therefore, in the margin of knowledge properly speaking, an analogy between two operations, an analogy that is a certain mode of communication. The individuation of the real, exterior to the subject, is grasped by the subject due to the analogical individuation of knowledge within the subject. But it is through the individuation of knowledge, and not through knowledge alone, that the individuation of non-subject beings is grasped. Beings can be known through the knowledge of the subject, but the individuation of beings can only be grasped through the individuation of the subject's knowledge. Maybe we can wrap up and we can discuss a couple of the notions of that paragraph just next time, right before we start on the first chapter, unless someone has like a burning comment or question, because we're just sort of running up on the time limit here. Okay, yeah, so let's end there. And thank you everyone for participating, and see you all next week, and we'll start on chapter 1 of the book.